Well, hello, my little loves. So, today we're going to do our third lesson on these two poems from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. We've already done an introduction to the two poems, The Tide Rises and the Tide Falls and the Psalm of Life. We did a deep dive in the Psalm of Life last week, and today we're going to do a deep dive into the Tide Rises and the Tide Falls. So, I just want to do a quick recap. So last week we did a deep dive into A Psalm of Life, which remember Longfellow wrote when he was in his early 30s. He was reflecting on the loss of his first wife and his first child, and he was talking about how when life gets hard, you kind of have to pull up your bootstraps and move forward. And I want you to remember that that poem was full of positive energy. So, this was a young man who had a lot of his life left in front of him, and he was really filled with positive energy, very focused on inspiring others and being better and being amazing and really looking at life like every day is a new day and I've got to live my best life today and be one step further tomorrow. And then we get to the tide rises and the tide falls, which, as I told you in our introductory lesson, Longfellow wrote when he was in his late 70s. Many people believe that this is one of the last things that he wrote. So we're going to read this over again. And I want you to think about all that positive energy and that influence that we felt in the Psalm of Life. And then I want you to sort of look at the tide rises and the tide falls and think about how that is completely different in this poem. And remember, this is the same person, right? So this is the same person like 40 years later. So the tide rises and the tide falls. The tide rises and the tide falls. The twilight darkens, the curlew calls. Along the sea sands, damp and brown, the traveler hastens toward the town, and the tide rises and the tide falls. Darkness settles on roofs and walls, but the sea in the darkness calls. The little waves with their soft white hands efface the footprints in the sands, and the tide rises and the tide falls. The morning breaks, the steeds in their stalls stamp and neigh, and the hostler calls. The day returns, but never more returns the traveler to the shore, and the tide rises and the tide falls. So I want to talk about the two different views of this poem. So one of the views of this poem is the idea that life changes and yet things stay the same. So, for example, if you've ever suffered a really major loss in your life, maybe somebody really close to you passed away, maybe your parents got divorced, maybe something bad happened at school, or maybe you lost a pet. One of the hardest things for humans to really come to terms with is that when bad things happen to us, the world continues to go. The tide rises and the tide falls. It doesn't really matter what happens in our personal lives because tomorrow the sun's going to rise and then it's going to set and then the same thing is going to happen again. And that is one view of this poem where Longfellow says, day to day stuff in the grand scheme of things doesn't really matter. What matters is that there is a consistency in the world and that even if he's not here, the tide is going to rise and the tide is going to fall and life is going to continue. So that's one sort of look at the way this is written. The other that I find very interesting is that the traveler is actually dying. And they say the tide rises and the tide falls, the twilight darkens, the curlew calls. Along the sea sands, damp and brown, the traveler hastens toward the town. The tide rises and the tide falls. And the reason that people say this is because in the bottom stanza, it says, the day returns, but never more returns the traveler to the shore, indicating that the traveler has passed away. And so he's made that sort of transition from life to the afterlife. One of the reasons that I find this poem so interesting, and I also find it interesting that Longfellow wrote it, is that in the Psalm of Life, he talks about footprints, right? So he talks about footprints in the sand. And he says, lives of great men remind us we can make our lives sublime and departing leave behind us footprints in the sands of time. Footprints that perhaps another, sailing o'er life's solemn main, a forlorn and shipwrecked brother, seeing shall take heart again. So in that poem, he sees these footprints in the sand as incredibly important and there to help other people in their journey. The reason I find this so fascinating is that 40 years later, he uses that same image, the footprints in the sand, but he says the little waves with their soft white hands efface the footprints in the sands, and the tide rises and the tide falls. Efface, by the way, means erase. And so, unlike his poem in his early 30s, where he's saying these footprints are everything and they help others when they struggle, all of a sudden he says that time, the little waves, takes away those footprints. So it's an interesting difference. So does Longfellow now believe that what we do in our life at the end of the day doesn't really matter? Because at the end of the day, those actions will be wiped away and the tide will rise and the tide will fall and the world will go on. It's a really interesting way to look at it. You know, this poem, although not negative, there's not negativity here. There's just a lot of contentment, acceptance, like that, you know, you're on earth and you live and you're happy and you're sad and then you pass, and it's sort of the way things go. The tide rises and the tide falls. It's not a coincidence that he repeats that line over and over again. He's trying to call your attention to the passage of time. I do often wonder, so is this a different Longfellow? Did he believe all of a sudden that the things that we did in life didn't matter? Because I don't want to believe that, because the Psalm of Life, as I told you, is one of my very favorite poems, and I cannot imagine that that would change. I will tell you, the first time I read it was when I was your age. I actually copied it out of my English book and I taped it up on my mirror, and it stayed there for my entire time through high school. I put it in my wallet, in my purse, until it fell apart. And then, of course, the internet was invented, and so I could access it anytime I wanted to. And I'm 45, and I continue to love this poem. I love its optimism. I love its feeling. The tide rises and the tide falls is sort of oddly comforting. You know, the idea that the world continues. And I think with what we're facing today, that's the idea I want you to take away from this. Whether you believe in that first poem's, inspiration and awesomeness, or you believe in this second poem's, the tide rises and the tide falls, what I want you to take away from this, two things. One, you need to write, because this shows you how different you will be in the next few decades. That's why you need to write today. You need to record how you're feeling and talk about what you're thinking. It's important. Even if you are the only one who reads it, you need to write. The other is that the tide rises and the tide falls, my loves. So, yes, this is not a good situation right now. And it's hard and it's challenging. But the tide rises and the tide falls. And this is going to be at its end. It will end. We don't know when, but it will. And when that happens, we're all going to be together again at school and everything is going to be okay. So I know that things are challenging and I know that many of you are struggling, and I think of you every day. But know that the tide rises and the tide falls. Every day we get closer to that day that we're all back in my classroom and we're all screaming about that you all need to settle down so that I can teach you your lesson. Okay, I miss your faces. I hope to see you soon. And I'm going to check in with you again in another couple of days with another Fireside Poet.